Okay, I will get started. I do want to mention, so I am recording myself to self-document. That's one of the things that's really helped me with art grants, is to self-document talks, performances, Q&As, whatever it is. If you ask a question and don't want to be in it, just tell me, and I can make sure I don't use that part. But I'll probably just use the clips where I'm talking and performing. And it's one of those things. Dan wanted me to ask or talk a little bit about getting art grants and that process, because it was pretty opaque to me before I started it. And self-documenting is an important part of it, because it's a lot easier. Well, it's a lot of applications often ask for it, like videos of your work or audio or whatever the format is. It's easier to refer to a video in an application and just show what your work is, rather than, like, describing work is hard enough without following up with a video. So that's something that I often do. And then the other thing I do is, because part of the performance will be music coming off of these machines, I record it with a field recorder as well. So I've got two audio sources. I'll get the audio of the room, which has that kind of ambient white noise, or just the ambient sounds that are in a room, and then I get a pure clean signal directly from the machines as well, and then I mix those two so it's clear, but also you can tell it's still in a room. A little bit about myself. What's the time frame? I want to schedule myself around your
we
time
have just over an hour.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I'm actually alumni here. I got a graphic design degree here at Iowa, and when I left here, I went to San Francisco briefly. Didn't like San Francisco. Thought I would. I thought it'd be a really good place for art and design, and it wasn't for me. I think it is for other people, and that's one of the things I've learned, is that different places click for different people. And so if you go to a scene and it just isn't working, like, try a different scene or try a different place. Even if you see other people succeeding in it and you think, well, I should be succeeding too, it might not just be the right fit. I moved then to Minneapolis for a year, and I started taking multimedia classes at MCAD up in Minneapolis. And it was, I was working at the time. It was a startup company there, and taking classes at night at MCAD. So at the time I was learning Director, which was used to create CD-ROMs, which I don't even know if that makes sense to anyone except Dan in this room. So CD-ROMs, do you know what CDs are?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you know what CD-ROMs are?
Yes.
Okay, we're good. Do you know what Director is? Okay. So Director was the software that you could make CD-ROMs, and it was just a way to make multimedia.
What's a CD-ROM?
What is a CD-ROM?
Yes.
It is a data CD, and so you could load projects on your computer, and they were really kind of early interactive type of. A lot of times they would be sold with a music CD, so you'd get you could play the music in on a stereo, but you could also load it on your computer, and you might get extra, like, concert footage or information about the band or behind the scenes, et cetera, et cetera. And then, so I learned that, and it was an introduction to creating multimedia projects digitally with a timeline based, and using symbols and creating objects and having those objects interact, combining video with text, interactivity. And then quickly, as CD-ROMs were kind of fading out, I took a class in Flash, which now is also gone, and did Flash programming, animation development for about 12 or 13 years. I moved to New York. I wanted to be in a bigger city again. And I always thought I wouldn't like New York, and New York was great for me. I went there, I got a job right away. I just assumed, like, everything would be as hard as it was in San Francisco, and it wasn't. For whatever reason, New York fit for me, and got a really good job right away and started doing multimedia. And it was one of those things, coming from Iowa, I didn't realize the opportunities that could happen being somewhere like New York. Like my first project was working on an X-Men game with Wolverine, a side scroller that was it was one of the X-Men movies, I think an early one. But for me, growing up, like reading X-Men comics, that was fantastic. That was my first job in New York. Worked for a bunch of different entertainment clients, and it was a small web shop in Union Square downtown. And I worked there for about a year. Then 9/11 happened. A bunch of the smaller shops closed, shut down, just because the whole economy froze for months. And I started doing freelance. And my first freelance job, and this was pretty consistent, was every single job I got from then on was through someone that I had worked with in that original company. So that's something that's carried on throughout my artistic career, is that no matter what environment I'm in, just to do the best I can. There's been times where I've played shows, like, talk about test of endurance. So I've also done techno for about 25 years, where I've done techno shows like in a big space to like 4 people. I mean, it's just the most like painfully humiliating experience of just being. If it's a small venue, it's not as bad, but it was like the sound guy, the promoter, like the other artists, we were just essentially doing a sound check for each other, just no one came. But because, I was booked to do an hour techno set, I did an hour techno set, and one of the guys there was from France, and later that year, he contacted me when I was over in Europe and said, hey, do you want to do a tour? I did a tour. There was a particular show I did in Brittany, which is West France. It was really an insane show. But again, just like showed up and did it, recorded it, self-documented, posted that, even just briefly. It was such a hardcore set. I only posted it for like a month or two. A woman in New York heard it who was really connected to the techno scene in America. And then fast forward a few months later, I'm at this huge festival here in the Midwest, and the woman who liked this set from France, and the reason I was at France because I did a good job at that crappy show with 4 people, I was like last minute put up as a headliner on a stage in front of 3,000 people. And so all that tied back to good behavior no matter what the opportunity is. So if you're in a like small studio or small company, or if you have an opening and 2 people show up, you just don't know what seeds are planted. And it's hard, like the level of endurance it takes to be like, okay, I'm gonna show up, this isn't what I expected, but just do the best I can over and over, and those opportunities really open up. I was in New York for 9 years, moved out to California, Berkeley and LA, and my multimedia work was very corporate for many years, and I just, it was good money, it helped me live in New York, helped me live in LA, and I got to a point where I just wasn't doing the level of creativity I wanted anymore, and started to slowly phase out. And that's another thing, is I was doing freelance work so I could start to scale towards full-time art gradually. It wasn't one of those things where it's like, okay, I'm quitting my job, I'm gonna be a full-time artist starting today. I didn't have to like tank everything in order to move over. It was a very gradual process, and that made the whole process smoother. And I started going over to Berlin more, and that was one of those things where a lot of my friends had moved over there, so when I got there it was very easy. It just as easily could have been Amsterdam or Tokyo or wherever it was, but that happened to be where the people I knew were, so I went where there was an easy transition. And then I've been in Iowa off and on the last few years, and just the last bit about art grants is, if it's a situation where I can be in the room with a person rather than just doing something that's across the country or across the world. So a lot of the funding I've gotten this last year is from the city of Iowa City, and also the Stanley Museum here. And then also a private art studio here that's associated with engineering school. And that was just through people I'd known, I'd worked with, I'd been in class with. It was just this personal extension, and it just continued out. So I'll start talking about the actual projects. One of the macro ways of looking at my work, and This stuff only comes later. So it's like when you're reading, a synopsis of an art thing, at a show. I'm guessing, I don't work this way, but I make intuitively. Like there isn't a plan of like, oh, I'm gonna do this thing and it's gonna be about X, Y, or Z. I'm just intuitively drawn to something and then I create something, and then later a context may emerge, or later someone else may get meaning from it. And so this whole idea of generative systems is something that I was just drawn to them naturally in the course of making work, and only later did I realize I was building generative systems. I made techno just in a standard way for about 20 years. I got my first drum machine in '95. It was like $100 at a used, like a guitar store or whatever. And that also speaks to it's good for me to have a limited palette. I had friends around that time start with entire studios, and they never made anything. They sold drugs and bought a bunch of gear all at once, where they had sequencers, synthesizers, drum machines, recorders, and just didn't know where to start. I started with just a drum machine, and I used that thing, I programmed it, I made as many songs as possible, filled up the memory, recorded to tape, started all over, just experiment with one tool, and doing that over and over helped me become an expert in that. And by doing that, when I added the next piece, I was ready for it. And that helped me push things to be more creative with the tools I had. And so a lot of times people have a concern of getting started with either art or technology about funds. And it's like, I buy the cheapest possible thing or program what I know with. Like a lot of the work, what you'll see here and what you'll see if you go to the parking ramp exhibit, which is, do you know where the music building is? It's right across the street from that. So it's like the mill and the music building. It's that stairwell, and it has you can see into it. It's got that tinted glass, 5-story. So that's my canvas right now at the installation piece. That whole thing's powered by an iPhone, because I know how to program iPhones. That's something I had learned. If I were using processing or Arduino board, then I would use that if that was what I enjoyed. So it doesn't matter if someone else is using a certain technology. I just use what I know and what is easy and fast for me to program with. When Dan was there, he's like, "Where's your server?" It's like, here's my server. The first generative system I made was, I was inspired by some of Brian Eno's work. He has a music app called Bloom, and you tap the screen and it just goes into a looper and it fades out, and then new notes come, and I don't even know if they're even related to the notes that you choose, but it's a generative music app. You just tap the screen and it's pretty sounds. And I wanted to make something based on that concept, and so I started with choosing my own sounds, tapping the screen, it goes into a looper. Each sound had a different loop length, and so the composition would, track 1 would loop like that, track 2 would loop like that, so the composition would always be varied. And I wanted to create something that always had a different sound. And as I continued to develop it, I realized instead of just doing randomly choosing new notes or new instruments, I had all the user tabs. And so when using the app, choosing a few notes and listening to those loops, and then going in and being like, oh, I want those, and then I'll add a few here, and then let play for a while, and then I'll add a few more. I started to take all of those user selections, remember them, and process them, and start to create the new, instead of random notes coming up, have them based on what the user had chosen. And in that way, I kind of fell backwards into AI. And I realized, oh, I made artificial intelligence. This app learns the user and then makes compositions that sound like that user. And so people ask, like, do I have computer science training, or do I have, machine learning training? And I don't. It's just the creative process has led me to this type of thing where I was able to develop an AI. So that generative system, do I have that? Yes. So a generative algorithm or an AI. So the basic of any generative system is that there is a container, and for that original app, the container is, it's on an iPhone. I chose the sounds as the developer. I chose what scale it could be in, and I chose the note range, you know, how high or how low it could go. And the randomizing element, so the user chooses initial notes, and then it goes in and it's an algorithm that starts to churn out new sequences. And that randomizing element goes into the generative container. And I think of it as a metaphoric container, so it has walls of parameters. You know, it won't go outside a certain note range, or it can't play a sound that's not loaded into the system. So there's boundaries there that it can't cross outside of. And when developing these systems, the creative part, the aesthetic part, is deciding, will these sounds sound good no matter what this randomizing generative element does. You know, if it churns out as many notes as possible in a particular circumstance, does that still sound good? If it's silent for a period of time, how long is that silence? Do the high notes and the low notes, do they work on the sound system that can be produced out of an iPhone, you know, which is just the, you know, 1/8" jack. So that's the creative process, is creating this container and determining all the different infinite possibilities that could happen inside that container. Then when I actually perform, I used the music app for live performances, because I got to a point with performing techno where I got bored because I knew the music really well, and I wanted to be able to hear the music new as if everyone in the audience was. So I wanted to hear my music through the audience's ears, and I did that by creating, you know, this randomizing system. And so what I would do is have the app route the MIDI into, I would set up the keyboards and drum machines, and then I would tap the screen a few times to get the system going, and then it would do the sheet music. It would do the composition for the rest of the set. And then what I would do is turn the knobs on the synthesizers and change the sound and control the mixer. And so in some ways it was like I was playing with like a robot bandmate. Like, it was doing all the notes and then I was doing all the manipulations. The next generative system I made was, I started working with a dancer in Berlin, and she had worked with motion sensors before, and it was a situation where her motion sensors controlled the lights, but she wanted to be able to control the sound. And I met her randomly. It was at a wedding in Berkeley, and I was like, oh, I could do that. I've already created this music system. It's already used to taking in all sorts of inputs. And so I started working with her, and I tried a few different sensors at first, but I settled in on, they're called Myo, M-Y-O, and they're these wristbands that are kind of rubber. The advantage to those is that if they fall off or if they go flying across the room, they don't break. And my first prototype was little Arduino boards, and they can break. And my second prototype was actually using iPhones and like trying to strap them onto her, and they would fly off and break. So the wristbands were good. And so I would put one on her wrist and one on her ankle, and I would get accelerometer data. And that, so it'd be X, Y, Z, and what would come in was, do you know what floats are? Like 0 to 1. A float is like a decimal, and so I'd get 1.3 or a minus 2.7, and the creative part of that was getting the randomizing element. That was her movement. So once it actually came to the performance, it was all improv. All the work happened before, and then the time of the performance, I could just sit back and watch, and she would do improv. and all the sounds were all remapped that no matter what she did in her improv dance, it would look cool and it would sound cool. And that's where the work went in, is developing those parameters, those boundaries of no matter what she did, it would look good. With that system, it would take that movement data, and it was Bluetooth, and I've had better luck with Bluetooth as opposed to Wi-Fi, because most people, if in the studio it always works, and even just, earlier trying to figure out the HDMI, like that always happens. Like it always works in the studio, and then you get to the actual performance and like something happens. Like that's different. Probably worst case scenario with that was actually, I was doing that motion sensor performance with a dancer here at the university, Christopher McMillan. We were doing a show up at CSPS in Cedar Rapids. And I went early. It was my first time working with him. And for some reason in my mind, I was like, I want to get to the venue really early, do setup. I got there 2 hours early. And I started testing the 2 motion sensors. One was working and one wasn't. I'm like, fuck. So I rebooted it. I reinstalled the firmware. I rebooted the phone like 15 times. And it just wasn't seeing one of the sensors. And I was like, okay, maybe I'll just like improv and play along the sounds from this second sensor while he triggers the first sensor live. And usually this happens with problem solving right when I take a break or start to step away from it. It's like, oh, that's it. And what was different between my studio and the performance space was I had a camera set up. And it was a phone that I had recently switched away from. And I was like, I went to it, I looked at it, and it had an old version of my app on it, and the other sensor had paired to the old phone, and the other sensor had paired to the phone I was trying to use. And those sensors can only pair to one device at once. So I just had to shut it down on that, and then it worked. So it's those types of things of being an environment, it's always different. So if I always try to get to a space early and do testing beforehand, if possible. And so I've been using Bluetooth instead of Wi-Fi. I've talked with artists who use Wi-Fi, and it'll work good in the studio, and then in the actual performance, if there's a few hundred people there with phones that are trying to ping a Wi-Fi network or just on a network, it creates more traffic, and so sometimes communication is harder. Bluetooth is such a direct pairing. I've had good luck with it. It says the range is like 10 meters, but some of the dancers have walked like out of the room and like down far, so I would say up to maybe 50 meters, and there's still responsiveness.